So the topic of tonight's webinar is what's left of Labour, a question I think many of us are asking ourselves at the moment. I'm not going to talk very long at all. I just want to give a little bit of context for the meeting. I suppose start by saying that, you know, the sort of obvious that we live in incredibly difficult and uncertain times, but also very hopeful times. And it sort of seems that we're standing at the threshold of some kind of historical rupture. And it's crucial at this time that the socialist left, both here in Britain and elsewhere, are at the forefront of shaping the future political agenda. But around 3 months after Keir Starmer became leader of the Labour Party, the shift to the right within the party has been even faster and even more decisive than I think you know, many of us feared. There's a new kind of purge of anti-racist, internationalist party activists on the way, including some comrades, some local comrades in Brighton and Hove. Some of you, I think, who are listening right now, as well as one of our speakers this evening, Professor David Miller, who chose to resign the other day following his suspension, citing the party leadership's appalling response to the Black Lives Matter protests and its tolerance of anti-Black racism, Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism. On both foreign and domestic issues, Starmer has clearly and decisively departed from the socialist and internationalist platform of Jeremy Corbyn. In addition to his support for the pro-Israel lobby, he has effectively abandoned what was the party's democratically adopted sort of policies to support the right of the people of Kashmir to self-determination. He has recently sided with the Tory government, as far as we know, in terms of harsh jail sentences for people who vandalise colonial monuments, and he condemned the toppling of racist slave trader Edward Colston of his statue as completely wrong. And at a time when racial and class inequalities have been starkly and brutally highlighted by the COVID pandemic, and the government is trying to cover these up, the need for a radical anti-racist socialist agenda has never been greater. And in the absence of moral and political leadership from the Labour Party, it's up to us, the grassroots activists on the left, on the broader left in the party and beyond, to push for change and to challenge the narrative and to change the debate, and when necessary, to take to the streets to demand a better, fairer and radically different society. So our now two speakers this evening will highlight some different challenges that are facing our movement at the moment, and perhaps also offer some suggestions for how we might go forward. And I hope that we will all come away with a renewed determination to organise and take action. So that's what we really need to do right now. Just a couple of housekeeping matters before I introduce the first speaker. So we will have a joint Q&A session after the two talks. If you want to ask a question during the Q&A, there's a little hand raising function that you should see, I believe, at the bottom of your screen, though it might depend on what kind of device you've got. So please use that, and Zoom will, or webinar will record the order in which people raise their hands, so we should be able to get to you in the correct order. You can also use the chat function throughout the webinar to chat with other participants. And there's a Q&A, sort of written Q&A function as well that you can use. We will keep an eye on that, depending on how busy it gets and how many questions we get through that. We might not be able to put them all individually to the speaker, but we'll sort of keep an eye out for any kind of common themes that emerge in that case and raise them during the Q&A. And the obvious, please, you know, adopt a respectful and dignified tone of debate. Any trolling or abusive language is obviously not tolerated, and you will be removed immediately. If you ask a verbal question, can I ask you to try to keep it relatively brief so that as many people as possible get a chance to ask their questions. We've got quite a busy meeting. Right, so I will stop talking now and introduce our first speaker, Katherine Connelly, who is a writer, historian, activist and editor of Counterfire. She led the school strikes against the Iraq Walk in 2003 and coordinated the Emily Wilding Davison Memorial Campaign in 2013. Her biography of Sylvia Pankhurst was published that year as well, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about Starmer's first months as leader and what the implications are for the party and for the left more broadly. And let me just work out how to get her up on the screen and get rid of me. Just one moment. There we go. All right. Kate, it's the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Asa, and thank you everybody for having me. Is this volume okay?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so as Asa said, I'm the editor of the Counterfire website, which is the website of Counterfire, the organization. And I think I should start off by saying from the outset that I'm not a member of the Labour Party. But our organisation has enthusiastically and very much so supported the Corbyn project and wanted that to succeed as far as it could and for it to be as radical as it could possibly be. And to that end, as well as supporting the Corbyn project, we also helped to organise against the attacks of Labour's right wing against Jeremy Corbyn and of that wider political project. And that was because we saw this as the development that was inspiring very, very large numbers of people and giving people confidence that a different world could be created after 4 decades of the mantra of there is no alternative, neoliberalism, that we'd all been fed, that this was something that was incredibly inspiring and really changing the way that people were thinking about the world and about the possibilities for radical change. So our organisation worked with comrades on the Labour left, not just in supporting the Corbyn project, but also in wider movements, Stop the War campaign, for example, in anti-austerity campaign and many other campaigns besides. And despite the reservations that I'm going to express about what can be achieved for the left within Labour, we will always continue to work with those comrades that in the Labour left. So I want to start off really by saying that. So to kind of bring things a little bit more up to date, since Starmer was elected just over 3 months ago, sorry. No, 2 months. He has disappointed, I think, even the very low expectations that many people had, but also the expectations of those who thought that his pledge for unity, party unity, was actually genuine. And I think how false that was has been proved by subsequent events. Very much the clearing out of prominent Corbyn supporters, almost wholesale from the shadow cabinet, but also the personnel and staff within the Labour Party. And I think the experience of what happened to the Corbyn project, which was this enormous and inspiring opportunity, I think for me shows that the idea of reforming Labour to the left is something that I don't think is viable. But I want to talk a little bit about what Keir Starmer has done, because I feel that while the promise of unity within the party and unity with Corbyn supporters was shown to be utterly false very, very swiftly indeed, Keir Starmer did manage to find unity with the Tories. And in fact, one of the very first things that he did once he'd been elected as leader was to tout the idea of him joining a national government, despite the fact that this hadn't been proposed by the government themselves, and of course, despite the fact that this is a government characterized by the most vicious kinds of class hatred. And I really feel like the dominant tone of Starmer's leadership has been to give cover to, but also to bolster the government's effort at prioritizing the needs of business above those of people's lives, whether that be Starmer very, very swiftly urging what he called a lockdown exit strategy at a time when the lockdown had been won by mass pressure from ordinary people and was something that the government was absolutely bitterly opposed to. Whether that be him putting pressure on the schools to be amongst the first institutions to go back, right in the face of and in opposition to what the teaching unions had been organising for, and of course how very many parents up and down the country felt about this. And then also, of course, in the face of a growing mass movement against racism, Starmer used the opportunity to say that it was, quoting him, completely wrong to tear down the statue of a slave trader in Bristol, over which there's been a very long campaign to get that statue removed by local people in Britain, and has also supported the racist Home Secretary Priti Patel in her claim that she wants to introduce 10-year sentences to those that vandalize statues or war memorials. Therefore, at this moment, to give more draconian powers to exactly the forces in society that this movement has been exposing of perpetuating institutional racism. It's been an absolute disgrace. And this, of course, is coming in the context of the most enormous attack on working class people, following on from 10 years of austerity. We have been told by the former chief scientist to the government that the death toll, which in this country is one of the worst in the world, that death toll could have been halved had the lockdown happened earlier. In other words, had the government been forced to follow a sensible policy, which of course it very much could have done, learning the lessons from around the world, had it put people's lives before profit. So we know that the death toll could have been much, much smaller. This has also happened in the context of course, our society, in which inequality has been deeply intensified by those 10 years of austerity, but also a class divided society, and one that also relies upon racism, in which we are seeing disproportionate numbers of deaths in Black and ethnic minority communities, and particularly those communities that are among the poorest in this country. This comes in the context of an incredible level of child poverty, which has been worsened by the decisions of this Tory government. And obviously recently, light was shed on that, and that brilliant victory by Marcus Rashford. It comes in the context of the abandonment of the care homes by the government, of the complete lack of PPE being provided for frontline workers, and also of a government whose contempt for working class people really was felt by so many to be epitomized by the attitudes of Boris Johnson's chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, not only the person behind the herd immunity strategy, which as far as I can see is just continuing by stealth. It's not been something that's been fundamentally scrapped, but also somebody, of course, who flouted the rules quite outrageously and has been kept very cozily within the corridors of power. So that is the context in which Keir Starmer is making those decisions. But the other side of that is, I think there is a huge level of emerging resistance to what's happening at the moment. There is, as I said, an emerging global movement against racism, the size and the scale of which has been incredibly inspiring, the like of which we haven't really seen since the height of the anti-war movement in 2003, particularly in terms of the kind of number of countries in which this has affected, the fact that this is a mass mobilization taking place in every single American state, and then thinking as well about how this has resonated and organized people globally. Also, I think in the way that people have organized against being attacked at work, in the context of the pandemic, starting really with the workers at Lewisham Hospital, the porters and the cleaners who walked out, but also extending to teachers. And I think it's very significant that the brave and brilliant stance taken by the National Education Union to resist the government's very dangerous policy is something that's inspired lots of people to get involved in the union and to see the union as something very important. And we know this from the many more people that have been joining the union in the wake of that stand of resistance, and the hundreds of people that have signed up to become union reps, which I think is very hopeful indeed. Also, if we think about what's been happening on the underground, certainly I'm speaking here from London, and certainly I think the action that the tube workers took to resist a roster that was going to be imposed, that was kind of business as usual sort of roster, the way in which they organized against that rank and file organization to stop that being imposed and to protect workers' lives, I think is very significant and very inspiring as well. And so I think when it comes to the question of what any socialist should be doing and where any socialist should be, that's the answer. It should be in the midst of these struggles, whether or not we are members or not of the Labour Party. I really think that it's our job to support and to amplify those struggles. So whether that's calling socially distanced demos in opposition to racism, whether that be rebuilding the movements that the witch hunts in the Labour Party sought to intimidate against the prevent agenda, the racist prevent agenda across the education system, whether that be supporting freedom for Palestine or the Stop the War campaign. I also think it means signing colleagues up to the unions in this moment and very much strengthening those defense organizations, but also thinking about what we do in our workplaces, not leaving it up to the unions, but thinking about how actively we make that relevant to the very severe dangers that we are facing. And also, I think it means linking up all of these struggles. So, for example, one resource that we've got on our website, I'm sure that others have done this as well, but I know that you can find it on the Counterfire website, is a motion that can be passed through either a CLP or through a trade union branch, which is a motion about justice for George Floyd. And I think that's incredibly important to try and cement the links between these movements. And what I want to end by saying is that I think this should always be a priority and a focus for socialists, because it's always outside Parliament. We know this from looking back at our history. It's always from outside Parliament that we win social change. Every single democratic reform that we've won, every single social right, every way that we've kicked back against the right wing has always been defended or led or fought for on the streets and in a movement outside Parliament, because that's where change happens. That's where Jeremy Corbyn and that hope came from. That's where his popularity came from. It was because he had spoken, this is why people knew him so much up and down the country, because he had spoken on so many platforms and engaged with so many campaigns, liberation campaigns, trade union campaigns, justice campaigns over the decades, because he was seen as somebody who supported those movements outside Parliament. And I think it's no coincidence that when he launched his campaign, or when that campaign really kind of galvanized its energy, it was on an anti-austerity platform, quite literally outside Parliament in Parliament Square. So I feel that's always where hope has come from. It's always where change has come from. And I think that's where hope and change is coming from today. So thanks.
All right. Thanks so much for that, Kate. Sorry, it's the tech side of things that's confusing me a little bit. Thank you. So I think I can see that a couple of people have raised their hands already, but I think we'll listen to David first, and then we'll do a joint Q&A at the end, because then we can have a bit more of a discussion. David Miller is Professor of Sociology at the University of Bristol and co-author of the book Bad News for Labour, Anti-Semitism, the Party and Public Belief. And I believe he's going to talk a bit about the future for the left and where we sort of go from here. So let me just see if I can get you up on the screen, David, just 1 second. Oh God, what have I done now? There we go. Right, David, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks, Kate, and hi, Kate, haven't seen you for a while. As you'll know, I resigned from the Labour Party on Monday after I had been suspended some weeks ago. I received some letters from the relevant part of the Labour Party, and it was clear to me that there was no prospect of any progress in relation to that. So I am now an ex-member of the Labour Party, not in the Labour Party like Kate is not, like you aren't, Becky. And I suppose I'd like to reflect a little bit on that in the context of thinking about the way forward. I mean, part of the trauma that people have gone through in being excluded or having to resign from the party has been that there was nothing that their comrades could do to support them, even where there were effective or strong campaigns to support people. Very few people got back in after those campaigns. Moshe McIlroy, one of them, I guess, but not very many others. And I suppose that part of what I think we might think about is, in terms of reclaiming the party for the left, if you like, is the extent to which it's going to be possible for people who remain in the party or those outside who want to support those who are in the party to act in solidarity with people who are targeted by the witch hunt. There are very many people now who have been forced out of the party as a result of their activism in relation to Israel-Palestine on the pretext sometimes of anti-Semitism. And it's been very difficult for people to, even where there's no evidence at all of anti-Semitism, in cases, for example, of Chris Williamson, of Tony Greenstein, many others. It's been very difficult for people to support those people, and they've been forced out in a way which is truly a violation of all the rules and principles of the party. So I wonder about the extent to which it's going to be possible to defend anyone in this process, if, as seems to be the case, Starmer is heading for, in the middle of, a purge against those of us who have been involved in Palestine solidarity work. I would also put that in the context of the fact that even during the period of Corbyn as leader, when the left was allegedly in control of the party, it was the case that the rules weren't applied fairly then either. Chris Williamson was expelled while Corbyn was leader. Many others were too. And at the very same time, in an absolutely clear contrast, those on the right of the party who breached the party's rules, according to the party staff, were not, the rules were not brought to bear upon them in anything like the same way. So there was no fairness in terms of the operation of the rules. I'm leaving aside the question about whether many of these people who were removed from the party for false allegations of anti-Semitism, I'm leaving aside the question of whether that was fair. But it's certainly the case, for example, with Margaret Hodge and many others who had certainly brought the party into disrepute. I mean, all of the people who launched the coup against Corbyn brought the party into disrepute, but none of them were targeted. And if the rules had been operated fairly, then they would also have been targeted. But the problem, of course, was that the leadership didn't want that to happen. And they, you know, I don't know exactly how this worked, but they intervened to make sure that the right would not be targeted, would not be suspended, that the rules would not apply to the right. And that was what everyone might say about the politics of John McDonnell, of Jeremy Corbyn, of the General Secretary. That was a mistake and was a clear indication that the rules only applied, and indeed then in a biased way, to the left. They didn't apply to the right. We've had what we've had. We've had Margaret Hodge, who was let off, and we've had Trevor Phillips, who remains suspended. There are many tens of Labour MPs who, if the rules were applied properly, would be currently or in the past have been suspended, auto-expelled or expelled on the grounds of racism, anti-black racism, yes, but in particular, Islamophobia. I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I don't want to name too many names here, but isn't it extraordinary that Sarah Champion remains an MP in good standing in the Labour Party? If the rules meant anything, she would have been gone years ago. So there's a real issue here that even during the period when the left was allegedly in control of the party, it couldn't even take those kinds of decisions. Now, the reason for that, of course, we know, and I'm sure Kate would tell us more about this if she was speaking, which is that the leadership decided that they couldn't split the party and that everything else came before that. And they decided, therefore, that the rules wouldn't apply equally. They would only apply in a biased fashion against the left and not at all against the right. And there was the problem, wasn't it? The problem of that when the left is in control of the Labour Party, it's unable to actually even operate the rules of the party effectively, never mind wage a factional fight against those who were trying to wreck the prospect of a mildly social democratic Labour government. So I think, you know, those of us who have been in the party or who have not been in the party are bound to pay some attention to what Kate was saying about the difficulty of reforming the Parliamentary Labour Party. Ralph Miliband expressed this very well in his book Parliamentary Socialism way back when, before his sons became leading operatives in the PLP. And so we are left now with the question of, well, first of all, what do you do with the PLP? Is it possible to reclaim the PLP for a mild social democratic programme? And the experience of the last 4 years is no, it's not. And so you've got a question about what does everyone do now? What should the strategy of socialists be? Should people stay in the party and fight and try and move the party back? Should try and engage in such democratic processes as remain and will remain under Starmer leadership? Maybe, but you know, given that we couldn't do anything much when Corbyn was in power, it seems unlikely that we'll be able to do much now that Starmer is in power. Let me just add a few words to what Kate said about Starmer. Are we surprised that Keir Starmer believes in targeting people who damage war memorials and statues of slavers? That he supports punitive punishments against them? Well, if we look back at his records when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, he was the one who insisted that thousands of, well, I think it was 1,400, wasn't it, in the end, young people after the 2011 riots were targeted with punitive sentences for for looting or rioting when they had done things like steal a bottle of water, or in other cases express their anger after, let's remember what happened, the police shot dead Mark Duggan in London. Strangely, Mark Duggan was, of course, a person of colour, was black. And, you know, that's the kind of thing which Keir Starmer did. He pursued those people expressing justified anger over police violence, which, again, unsurprisingly, has never been properly held to account. When was the last time a police officer responsible for the death of a person, most of them, of course, black, was brought to justice? Well, there hasn't been one for 50 years, has there? And so this is a really significant issue. And of course, Keir Starmer had his role in several of those cases. We remember the case of Ian Tomlinson, murdered by the police, a bystander in the protests 10 years ago. And of course, the case of Jean-Charles de Menezes, shot dead by the police, or was it a special military unit in Stockwell Tube Station, after he had run from the police, jumped the barrier, made suspicious movements. Oh no, those were all lies told by the police and by the intelligence services to justify a cold-blooded murder of someone who was Brazilian and was held by the people in pursuit of him to look a little bit Muslim. Of course, entirely innocent of anything, as everyone recognises. Who was the person who stopped the police being prosecuted in that case? Keir Starmer. Are we surprised that we now see Starmer and Angela Rayner in that embarrassing pose in their office, taking the knee, pretending solidarity with the struggle of the Black Lives Matter protesters? No, of course we're not surprised, and we will see much, much worse from Starmer. I get it. I get that people thought that Starmer might not be too bad after Corbyn, that he was, you know, not quite as right-wing as people on the left were saying. It's a similar feat that people managed, I remember, back in 1996, 97, when they said, well, you know, Tony Blair's just pretending not to be left-wing until we elect him. And once he's in power, don't worry, he'll be left-wing. Was he left-wing? Well, of course he wasn't, and nor was his successor, Gordon Brown, the allegedly austere leftist from the manse in Scotland. No, these people are not going to do things which are even mildly democratic. We can tot up on the fingers of one hand the progressive moves made by Blair and Brown in those years at a time where they specifically took actions which widened inequality, both at the level of class and at the level of ethnicity and race. So there is no prospect of Starmer being held to account by the party. The whole party machine was not moved over, taken over by the left. There were still significant places, including, of course, the regional offices where centrists controlled the operation. And that's why many thousands of people were suspended in the second Corbyn leadership contest. I was suspended. I wasn't able to vote for Corbyn in the second contest on entirely spurious grounds. And so we'll see much more of that. And the question then is, if there's not much prospect of winning the party back, which I'm skeptical of, you know, I appreciate some comrades will take a different view, then what do we do? There are, of course, other places that people who are on the left can go. Kate, of course, is in an organisation, should we call it a party, which you can join. And there are other leftists, what should we call them, Trotskyist parties of some description or other. There are other campaigns to get involved in, as Kate rightly said. There's the trade union struggle, and there's the incredibly inspiring Black Lives Matter struggle. I was at the demo, of course, in Bristol the other day. My daughter slept through the statue coming down, amazingly, given the noise that was made when it came down. But you know, those are incredibly inspiring events, and they move at the speed of light in a way which politicians of the centrist variety cannot keep pace with. And so let's be optimistic about that. There is a large reason to be optimistic about the Black Lives Matter protests and the way that will have of and has of refocusing attention on anti-Black racism, which hasn't gone away, on the crimes of the police against the Black community in this country, which continue, but also against the other kinds of racism which we see which are highlighted by the decolonizing movement. And of course, I work at the University of Bristol, which listeners and viewers may not know, has a deep, deep involvement with the slave trade. So that if you look at the University of Bristol's logo, you see that there are 3 images on it, which are associated with the Fry, the Wills, and the Colston families. So three images on the logo, all of which are associated with slavers or with tobacco merchants. And so our university has, rightly had a wide debate on this in the last week, and there are many people in the university, a reassuringly and refreshingly large number of the staff in Bristol outraged to things that they didn't know about the relationship with slavery and what that means in terms of how the university will have to change, in terms of not just of decolonizing the curriculum, as the phrase has it, but also in the question of the relationships between organizations like the Merchant Venturers, which tried to have the Colston statue plaque not changed only very recently, which is very closely linked into our university. So there's an ongoing process there, which I hope and trust will make a difference. There's an ongoing discussion about whether we retain, and I suppose some people might be shocked that this is the case, we retain the national anthem at graduation ceremonies. Incredible as it may seem for someone from Scotland that such a thing would happen, but it does. And so that those are all, that's a hopeful thing in relation to just to my own local situation in a university. But also I think that the questions this raises are questions about not just decolonizing in a historical sense, but decolonizing in the sense of ongoing relations of imperial dominance in the world. I guess would it be the case up until the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, it was more likely to be thought that imperialism was a thing of the past, that the term colonialism sort of describes the British Empire, which is now largely decolonized, not entirely, but largely decolonized. But of course, imperialism lives. It lives in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, brought about by Bush and Blair, as we recall. Kate, of course, was out demonstrating in advance of that, as was I and millions of others in this country. And it's visible also in the involvement of the British state, as well as other imperial states, especially the US, in military ventures in Libya, 2011, Syria, which is currently ongoing, and in Yemen too, and many other places. And so that, I think, is a question which is posed much more sharply by the Black Lives Matter protests. And of course, it poses also the question which I haven't mentioned yet, but which is obviously of huge pertinence to those of us who believe in anti-racism, the question of the Israel-Palestine struggle. Now, Israel-Palestine is as I mentioned at the beginning, is the issue which had many hundreds of thousands of people removed from the Labour Party. It was an issue on which most people in the Labour Party are agreed that there should be a Palestinian state, that there are those who think it should be a two-state solution, others who think it should be a one-state, but there is a very strong support for Palestinian rights amongst the membership of the Labour Party and even in some sections of the leadership of the party. But at the same time, there has been a very strong attack by the Israeli government and by the Zionist movement, by which I mean those organizations which exist in this country and in other countries which are part of the transnational Zionist movement, the key organizations which are headquartered in Israel. An attempt by the Israeli government and by the Zionist movement to normalize Zionism within the Labour Party. And I think that's been to some extent successful, and it was able to convince some elements of the left that there was such a thing, or could be such a thing, as left Zionism, which was not racist or which was anti-racist. Now, this is the difficulty with the question of Israel-Palestine. The colonization of Palestine was a colonial process. Israel is an imperial power, and it's difficult to say that in the current context in the Labour Party, where it is interpreted as if that means you are an anti-Semite. And the reason for that, of course, as we know, is because of the IHRA definition, working definition with the appended examples, which may, in context, relate to anti-Semitism. Of course, most I think of them mention Israel and are nothing to do with racism against the Jews, which of course all anti-racists oppose. And so there's been a real difficulty there in terms of trying to deal with that issue. But the Black Lives Matter protests, I think, put that squarely back on the agenda. Almost everyone recognizes that the occupation of Palestine and of the occupied territories is not just a human rights crime, a war crime under the Geneva Convention and international human rights law, but is a process of colonization. I would say it's the same in many respects as previous sorts of colonizations, but in the specific sense of one form of colonialism, which is settler colonialism. So the settlers in Israel-Palestine are analogous to the settlers who took over part of Ireland, for example, settlers who took America, Australia, New Zealand, Rhodesia, as it's called, South Africa, Algeria. It's a settler colonialism, which has a specific form which is different to the more general kind of colonialism which is seen in British India, for example. And it's difficult to say that in the current debate that there is in the Labour Party, because it's said to engage the IHRA definition. I don't think it really does if you look at it properly. But the question of racism against Palestinians is posed by the Black Lives Matter protests. And the question of whether Zionism is, by definition, in its actually existing form, a racist ideology is posed. I think it's clear for all of us who see this as a settler colonial problem that the answer to that question is obvious, that the creation of the State of Israel, the actually existing State of Israel, was a racist endeavour, to use the phrase from the IHRA examples. It remains a racist endeavour. It doesn't matter how long it goes on. It remains a racist endeavour, and the attempt to the passing of the nation-state law in Israel and the attempts to annex the West Bank and fittingly and obviously not give the Palestinians who are annexed any citizenship rights is a clear indication of a process of ongoing colonialism, which is a form, actually, as we know, of racism. And that, of course, is something which all anti-racists must and should oppose, and they do by and large. So I think that there is much optimism to be had in relation to all those struggles and in relation to the question of imperialism in contemporary politics. But if I can just say one last thing, and that is that there's a question about what we do, and I don't have the answers. There's an old IS slogan, wasn't there? One solution, revolution. But the question of what we practically do, it must be to continue to defend those who are attacked and defamed as anti-Semites, as racists by the Zionist movement. And that means practically defending them with solidarity, with campaigns, and indeed with money. We have to defend them, try and meet their legal costs where they are taken to court by representatives of the Zionist movement and their lawyers. And so I point you to the campaign for Chris Williamson, which I've been involved in, and it's recently launched, I think yesterday, launched Left Legal Fighting Fund. This is part of a set of activities which the Chris Williamson campaign and others associated have been involved in, which is intended to practically defend those who are blacklisted or who are witch hunted in a way which has not been done properly on the left, I don't think, so far. And that, I think, also is part of the process of building a resistance to the current assault on civil liberties and the current repression, which is led in this country by the Zionist movement in relation to these kinds of questions. And so I think that's one thing which is part of the process of resistance. There are many other things people can be doing, but I think there cannot be any progress in relation to this question of anti-Semitism, which is not going to go away until we face and defeat the enemy. And that can only be done by having concrete action on the left to do that, including, of course, supporting Palestinian rights, but also concretely defending comrades who are traduced and lied about, who are hounded out of their jobs, and who are placed in the position of having to leave the party or being expelled from the party. So I think that's one area in which we ought to and could be working. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Dave. It was David. So it was really interesting to follow the chat as you were talking as well. There's a lot that you said that clearly resonated with a lot of people who are in this webinar. Since we are a speaker short, there's about 8 of us in this sort of virtual room. So before I start taking, we've got a few people who raised their hands, but before I start taking questions, I would like to take the opportunity to put a couple of questions to the room, as it were, to the panelists as well, but also to all of you participants. A couple of issues that I felt sort of arose from the talks and also from reading your chats and questions. There seems to be a lot of agreement that at the moment it's difficult, if not impossible, to reclaim the Labour Party for the left, that there isn't much hope with the Parliamentary Labour Party in terms of change, and perhaps not with parliamentary politics at all. We had one question about that, whether the future lies outside of parliamentary politics. And another thing that I was sort of thinking about when I was listening both to Kate and David, and that I've thought about sort of more generally since the last general election especially, is that a lot of the challenges obviously that we face, that the left faces in Britain, you know, left-wing activists face across the world, in Europe, but also beyond. Yet, and at the same time, the sort of collective challenges that we face are global. Capitalism is global. The rise of the far right is occurring across the globe, and they are quite well organized across borders these days. And yet the left isn't really. I think it's fair to say. We are often quite tied down sort of in our domestic battles, in our sort of domestic parties and even our local battles. And so I suppose I've got two questions to the floor, if anyone has any comments about this in terms of how we go forward as the left. And one of them is, what other avenues should we be pursuing in terms of change, the kind of genuine radical change that I think a lot of us in this meeting want? Is it time to give up on the parliamentary route, or is it not? So that's one thing that I'd be really interested to hear what people think. And the other one is it time for a new socialist international, or is that a sort of outdated mode of organizing? And whether it is or it isn't, how do we forge better connections with other comrades in other countries, not just in Europe, but across the world, so that we can sort of take on the challenges together that are truly global. So I'd be really interested in hearing if anyone has any thoughts on that. Now we've got 3 people who've raised their hands, and we've got quite a few questions in the chat. Sorry, we've now got 4 people who raised their hands. So I think what I will do, a couple of people raised their hands quite early, so I will take your questions first, and then might take a question from the chats, and then go back to a couple of more verbal questions. So just bear with me for 1 second while I figure out how to do this, because this is my first webinar. Right, so we've got a question from Asa Winstanley. I'm just going to unmute you, just one moment.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, hi everyone, hi comrades. I do want to ask a question, but I want to make a point first, if I may. Is that
Yes,
okay?
you may.
Yeah. Yeah, I thank the comrades for their contributions. It was interesting presentations, and it's good for us all to think of a way forward. The point I want to raise is about what David talked about, the role of the Zionist movement and the pro-Israel lobby in the left in the UK. Stephen Salaita wrote this week. Stephen Salaita is a Palestinian intellectual and writer, a former academic who was deposed from his university after a defamation campaign against him, falsely alleging anti-Semitism. But he still carries on writing. And what he wrote something this week which I found really apposite, and I think we should learn from. And he said, systematic disposal of Palestinian narratives of justice in the USA is more dangerous than Israeli threats of annexation, referring to the annexation of the West Bank. And then he says, no capitalist or anti-imperialist formation will be effective if it leaves Zionism unscathed. Now, I'd like to suggest to comrades that this is literally true, that this isn't just, sort of flowery language to enlist people to his cause of Palestinian liberation, that it is literally true that no anti-capitalist or anti-imperialist formation in the West can be effective if it leaves Zionism unscathed. And I think the Corbyn years have really illustrated that quite dramatically, that, Jeremy Corbyn, who was the most leftist, anti-imperialist part of the Labour Party in terms of its parliamentary representation, ended up essentially capitulating to them and embracing them. We have to face up to this failure. Like, this is, and I include myself in criticism of that. I don't think I was critical enough of him as I should have been. And it to me, we see that in his embrace of the JLM, for example, even when it was exposed as, politic against him and openly opposing him, he went out of his way to embrace them. And this really led to his own downfall. So I think we're in danger of, as the left in this country, we're in danger of just sort of moving on and not learning this lesson, that we have to face up to the reality of what, as David puts it, the actually existing Zionist movement, what it does, and how it acts as what I would suggest is a vanguard of reaction and imperialism in the West. And it really acted as a vanguard against Jeremy Corbyn time and time again. And I think we have to begin to see how we can work against this and anticipate it in whatever, formations we have going forward, whether it's inside or outside the Labour Party. I mean, personally, I don't see much hope, any hope really, in the Labour Party going forward. But in whatever arenas that we find ourselves in, I think we have to start to seriously think about that if we're serious about our anti-imperialism, it has to be anti-Zionist as well. So I suppose to pose that as a question to the panelists, how can we learn the lessons of Corbyn's failure in this regard? Thanks.
Right. David, do you want to respond first? You're unmuted already, so that makes things a little easier.
Hey, Asa. Well, I think this is not just a question of the left. It's a question of the attempt by the Zionist movement in this country. Also, it's happened in France and Germany prior to this, to normalize Zionism on the left in those countries, yes, but also to normalize Zionism within the Muslim community. So people say, you know, oh, it's all gone now, isn't it, the anti-Semitism issue? Well, no, it's not. They're not finished. They are continuing to operate against the left, and they're continuing in a way which we people in the left, I wouldn't use the term white left, haven't noticed against the Muslim community. That's something which we need to be conscious of. The reason that they're doing this, of course, is that the only two forces which can threaten them are the Muslim, organized Muslim community and the left. And they are panicked, as have been the leaders of our country, of our state in the intelligence services, panicked by what they saw in 2003 and for a few years after that, of the organized Muslim community coming together with the organized left to march against the Iraq war. And I don't know if you all remember, but there was a moment which happened of unity there, where the Muslim Association of Britain and Stop the War Coalition, which of course is a coalition of various other groups, along with C&D and others, came together, and MAB said, look, the theme of this demonstration should be Palestine. It shouldn't just be about being against war or about Iraq, it should be Palestine. And there was kind of opposition in parts of the left and from some parts of Stop the War Coalition, etc., to that, but it was agreed in the end. And that was a breakthrough moment for pro-Palestinian politics. The main theme of this national demonstration, to which many thousands of people came, was Palestine. Palestine is the issue, as John Pilger has put it in successive documentaries. And that scared the Israelis. It scared MI5 and MI6. And in the States, it scared the security establishment there. And they've been operating since then to attack and dissolve the possibility of Muslims and the left working together on questions of imperialism. And they've done that by, Kate mentioned Prevent. That's what Prevent is for. Prevent is there to say, Muslims are bad. You don't really want to be getting involved with them. Look at they do these funny things. They're not good. And the deep Islamophobic nature of the Prevent policy is born out of that fear in the ruling class, that the fear that there's a force out there in the society that can work together, can defeat imperial ambitions. And that, of course, it worries the Israelis. And of course, the Israelis have sent people in to target that, to try and deal with that in relation to the Muslim community. In particular, they've done this through interfaith work, pretending that Jews and Muslims working together will be an apolitical way of countering racism and misunderstandings. No, it's a Trojan horse for normalizing Zionism in the Muslim community. And we saw it in East London Mosque, for example, where the East London Mosque unknowingly held this project of making chicken soup with the Jewish and Muslim communities coming together. This is an Israeli-backed project to normalize Zionism within the Muslim community. And they're doing that at the same time as they were doing the attack on Corbyn, and they continued attack on the left to normalize Zionism on the left. And they managed to, you said they were successful, Lisa. I think we can debate the extent to which they were successful, but they did manage to peel off a certain section of the left. And we saw that in the beginning, we didn't maybe realize at the time, with what happened to Jackie, who I know is in the calls now, who was peeled off from Momentum, and then elements of Momentum peeled off. I mean, if you look back at John Landsman's statements on Israel going back many years, he is much more critical. He says things about the Zionist movement and about Zionism, which would have him expelled from the party now. And so that something happened there. So even elements of Momentum became turned by kind of left Zionism, by elements of the JLM, partly no doubt to do with the pro-Zionists in the AWL, the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, pro-Zionist left. I believe Trotskyist is the appropriate term for them as well. So that I think is a real issue, and the Israeli government, of course, have been involved in this from the beginning. They've, first of all, and let me finish off by saying this. First of all, two strategies. One, they prepared the ground going back to the early 2000s by redefining anti-Semitism to include anti-Zionism, the creation of the new anti-Semitism. And they did that with hosting a huge number of events and conferences, including in London, but also in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and many other places, to bring together the idea that anti-Zionism could be anti-Semitism, and then the idea that anti-Zionism was always anti-Semitism. And that, of course, became the EUMC working definition of anti-Semitism, which was then transmogrified in 2016 into the IHRA definition. So that's one thing which was then used as a stick to beat the Labour Party, and indeed is being used as a stick to beat universities, student unions, colleges, and local councils, etc. And that will continue going forward. And then on the other hand, they sent in their undercover operatives and money from the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which of course, Asa, you've written about extensively, and I'm sure there's much more information to come out about that. They sent in Shai Massot, who was seen in that undercover documentary, to spread money around many of these new Zionist hawk organizations: Sussex Friends of Israel, Northwest Friends of Israel, Glasgow Friends of Israel, Lawyers for Israel, etc., etc., a whole range of other groups that sprung up in part due to direct subventions from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and then the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. And people imagine this has come about by accident. Well, no, it hasn't. This has come about by a deliberate strategy by the Israeli government and its allies in particular parts of the Zionist movement. And so that's not going to go away. And so I kind of agree with you, Asa, but I think the problem is perhaps deeper than even you are suggesting. And that's something which we have to face. It's there, and not talking about it will not defeat it. It has to be confronted.
All right, thanks, Dave. Kate, do you want to comment in response to that question as well? I'm trying to unmute you. There we go.
Yeah, I'll just say a few things. Thanks very much, David. I mean, my approach on this, I feel it's not necessarily that useful to kind of look for the fatal flaw in terms of what Corbyn did or didn't do or should or shouldn't have done, but to ask the question, why was he in such a weak and isolated position? And I think the focus upon him as an individual, as well as a reflection of that, just how isolated he was inside the Labour Party on this issue. And I think this brings us back to important historical questions about what the Labour Party is and what it's composed of, and therefore what kind of strategies are best going to help us win. You know, historically, the Labour Party has been pretty appalling on the question of Palestine right from the very beginning. You know, you can read George Padmore, the Pan-Africanist and socialist activist on this, writing in 1944 about before even Labour got into government the following year. You know, really writing about what they would then do to the Palestinians and opposing that. Why is this? And I think that's because the Labour Party is composed of two very unequal halves. There are those from the left, the activists, the campaigners, the rank and file grassroots members. But also there is a very significant and powerful portion of the Labour Party who are quite deeply embedded in the British state and are very happy with that and wish for that to continue. That's where their jobs are. These are the Tony Blairs, the Alistair Campbells, the Peter Mandelsons, all of these people. That's where they see themselves. That's where their loyalty is to. It's got no connection to organised labour or to the organisations of the working class in this country. And therefore, it comes down to this question about unity and also what people are loyal to. When push comes to shove, the right wing inside the Labour Party are always more loyal to the establishment than they are to the future of the Labour Party. And we saw this in a whole number of instances that I could go through, but probably wouldn't be that useful, and probably all of you know them from the Corbyn years. Whereas inside the Labour Party, the left has always stuck to this idea of we must stay loyal to Labour, we mustn't split the Labour Party. In that contest, who's going to lose and who's going to win? It's absolutely obvious. But I think also this question about the way in which the unequal halves in the Labour Party and the way in which they are, there is a section that is deeply embedded in the British state and shares the interests of the British state, also explains a lot about what happened, but also why it was over the question of foreign policy chiefly that Jeremy Corbyn was first and most devastatingly attacked. That's what they were most afraid of. That's what they found most threatening, to begin with, and that's what they focused on. It wasn't kind of advocating different economic policies so much. If we just think about it, what were the big kind of issues over which the real kind of pressure was put on? It was over Trident. It was even absurdly over the Stop the War dinner at one point, and of course over the question of Palestine. But this has historical roots. This isn't something that's just emerged recently. And so this is about what kind of a country we live in. When I say they are loyal to the British state, we live in a country which is an imperialist state. It has been for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that has not changed. Nothing has changed about the British state. And so when they are loyal to the British state, they are loyal to the imperial interests of that state. That's why it was over foreign policy. That's why it's always stuck with a kind of Atlanticist foreign policy. Very generally. But I also think it shows what they were terrified of, and that's, to come back to what David was saying. They were terrified of a huge anti-war movement that we created, that had to be created in opposition to the leadership of the Labour Party. I think that's important to say, and we did that with the left in Labour as well, and powerful support for Palestine. We know that George Bush and his acolytes were very, very worried that England or Britain had become the centre of Palestinian solidarity globally. And I think that's something we can be very proud of, but it's something that we also need to rebuild.
Right. Thank you, Kate. I agree with pretty much everything you both said so far. I think now we've still only got 3 people who've raised their hands. We've got quite a lot of questions in the written Q&A as well. I think what I might do is take those 3 questions from the floor all together, and then Kate and David, you can sort of respond to the main themes there, and then after that I'll sort of raise the questions that have come up in the written Q&A. So we've got a question from Tony Greenstein first. I'm going to turn you into panelist in a Tony. Can I ask you to please keep it brief, because we do have quite a few questions still that we want to put to the panelists. Tony, are you still there?
I think I've just been, can you hear me?
Yes, can't see you though.
Right, I don't know quite what's happened. Oh yeah, stop.
Okay, well we can hear you. Can you try to keep the question brief, please, Tony?
Well, I've got I'll try, but there are a number of things. 30 years ago, I wrote an article saying that anti-Semitism was a false anti-racism of the right. And we've seen that today for 5 years nearly. There was a massive attack on the Labour Party and on Corbyn by the right, using anti-Semitism as their false flag in a sense. Zionism was the cutting edge of the right. And I think what's clear is, and I follow on from what David Miller said and Asa Winstanley, is that, and Black Lives Matter has brought it out in particular, is that you can't be an anti-racist if you're not an anti-imperialist. That was very clear, and is very clear with Black Lives Matter, with the connection between Israel and training United States police forces. But you also can't be an anti-imperialist if you're not an anti-Zionist. And the left needs to understand that, because the left has been very weak on Zionism. It supported the Palestinians, but it hasn't opposed Zionism. The equivalent parallel would be in South Africa, where you say, oh, well, what happened to the blacks of South Africa was a human rights issue, but you don't talk about apartheid because you might upset certain people. For example, if we had Afrikaners living in Britain, it would become a domestic issue. Now, the reason I raise that is because the anti-Semitism campaign has not gone away, as David Miller himself proves. It's mutated into the 10 Commandments, the Board of Deputies pledges that Rebecca Long Bailey accepted. And this was brought out very clearly when Jackie Walker and myself spoke from the floor to Don't Leave Organised meeting. Immediately there were attacks on them for having spoken on the same platform as me and Jackie. The fifth commandment reads, thou shalt not speak with anyone who's suspended and expelled. And I had this again at Birmingham. I was invited by Birmingham Stop the War Coalition to speak. And Salma Yaqub was also invited. And immediately Ian Austin, the former rabid right-wing Labour MP, demanded that she be suspended. And what was extremely unfortunate, I think, is the Stop the War Coalition, which put out a statement for Salma Yaqub, also said in that statement, and I quote from it, local left Stop the War groups act autonomously in deciding their platform, but we note that Tony Greenstein has never been asked to address a National Stop the War Committee meeting. Stop the War Coalition rejects anti-Semitism and abusive language in political debate. Now, don't think that's the right reaction. When I wrote to Stop the War Coalition, Lindsay German, who is a founding member of Counterfire, wrote back defending what had been written and saying it wouldn't be taken down from their website. And I have to say, you don't make any accommodation to those who are trying to witch hunt and scapegoat people. On the contrary, we should be encouraging, and I know why Stop the War Coalition did that, because they want to retain their socialist campaign group MPs as patrons. But you don't actually win the battle by appeasing them and playing to those instincts. We have to encourage what's left of the left and the Labour Party to stand up to this witch hunt, because if they don't stand up to it together, they're going to be isolated individually, and they're going to also be singled out. I mean, it was I was accused, for example, and Lindsay German referred to abuse. Well, I was found guilty of abuse. I called Louise Ellman a supporter of Israeli child abuse of Palestinian children. And she was. Twice she defended the Israeli military in the parliament. Incidentally, I called Ian McNichol, who was a general secretary, crooked. Well, Len McCluskey has just called him crooked on the basis of the leaked Labour report. So what they call abuse is not abuse. And the left also has to get it together. I think it's been intimidated by the accusation of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is quite simple: hostility or discrimination against Jews. The reason the Zionists redefined anti-Semitism was they couldn't prove it against people with the old definition. Now, anti-Semitism basically is anything that is critical of Israel and Zionism. And we have to call that out. We have to be quite clear. I'm going to ask Kate in particular, is Counterfire anti-Zionist, or is it simply supporting Palestinian justice, which is what the statement on Salma Yaqub means? Because it's not enough to say, though, it's not anti-Semitic to criticize Netanyahu and the Israeli government, because many Zionists would agree with that. But when you criticize the fundamental nature of the Israeli state, a state which is in essence a Jewish supremacist state, then you're called anti-Semitic. And I think that's a very clear differentiation. And that, as regards the future of the left as a whole, I don't think the left and the Labour Party is going to be in a great position to actually carry on the fight at the moment, because Starmer has got all the key weapons. The ruling class in this country was determined that the Labour Party, the second major party in this country, a country which has a special relationship with the United States, should not be captured by somebody who they saw as opposed to everything that they stood for, and that was Corbyn. The tragedy of Corbyn is he never realised what the anti-Semitism attack was about. He took it personally and said, I'm not an anti-Semite. He didn't realise it wasn't about him as an anti-Semite. It was about Labour's position vis-a-vis the United States and imperialism. And Israel is the representative of imperialism in the Middle East. And they are the problems that we face. And it's important that we have some clarity on the left as to that. So when Jackie and me and others, like Steve Miller, for example, he's the latest, when people say, well, you can't speak on a platform with them, I expect left organisations to say, we're not going to put up with that. We're not going to have a situation where anyone expelled and suspended from the Labour Party is now treated like they were in South Africa under the Internal Security Act as a banned person, because that in reality is what the Zionists are pushing for today. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Tony. So I'm going to take one more question from the floor before we put this to the panelists, and then I think we've got in the Q&A, we've got some questions that are raising kind of more broader issues. So I think we'll take a couple of those after, so we can sort of widen the discussion a little bit. But we've got a question from Vin, who's joining us all the way from Durham, who I haven't seen in a long time. Vin's a lifelong socialist and anti-racist activist. Are you still with us, Vin? I'm trying to work out if he's still here. Right. Okay, we might take the next question in the meantime. So we've got a question from Dave, one of our comrades from Brighton. Dave, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm with you. And now I should be visible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Okay.
We can only...
This is important, this. Say that again.
No, nothing. Please go ahead.
Okay, yeah. This is pretty important, this particular webinar, because we're bringing together two of the largest left of Labour organisations. I mean, both Counterfire and the Labour Left Alliance have got what I think both claim over 2,000 individual members. So this is quite important, this meeting. I think a lot of people share my own history and experience. You know, Labour Party, we've been here with Tony Benn in the early 1980s. We've been here with Jeremy Corbyn more recently. And I'm getting a bit worried about whether I will ever see any successful left in this country. Because whenever we get successful, like in the 1980s, like now, recently, we get expelled. And that's the problem. The Labour Party, despite having a left-wing foot soldiers, we get expelled. What my own experience has been in over the last 20 years in Britain, together with many people who are taking part in this webinar, you know, in the Socialist Alliance, Respect, Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition, attempts to bring the left together. And this is no panacea, it's no solution, but my experience from Greece, which has a different electoral system, is that we can and we should bring together all elements of the socialist and Marxist and communist left, except I just make one exception for a group which is Zionist, the Alliance for Workers' Liberty. But apart from that, I think we can look at what's happened abroad. Sure, Die Linke and O Bloco Esquerda in Portugal, sure, they joined and they've sold out to reformism and supported carrying out of austerity. But I think it is time for perhaps Counterfire and the Labour Left Alliance jointly to call for a conference of the Marxist, socialist and communist left. problem is that all the previous groups that I mentioned, all the previous coalitions are founded because of sectarianism. But we always are, but we're now in a different phase. As Lenin said, there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. Comrades, decades are happening. They're happening now with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the anti-racist movement, into which we hope we can have the criticism. We work for the criticism of the Zionist attacks, Israeli government attacks on Palestine, etc. But I think the time is now for a conference of the whole of the Marxist and socialist left. Of course, to refer to some of the to Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin, then of course reform and revolution, social democracy and revolution are not irreconcilable. Reforms can be part, can be part of the road to a revolutionary, to a reconstitution of society on socialist and then ultimately on communist lines. So I think that despite the, I'll end up by responding to something, one of the chat comments, which said, Dave, basically, in Greece, you've got a system where you get 3% of the votes and you get representation. But look, to refer back to Lenin again, who knew in October 1917, who knew in the Les Événements of 1968 in France, who knew with the murder of Floyd George in the States, who knew that these events can suddenly explode? George Galloway, who I've worked with, I'm not promoting him, I'm not promoting anyone. George Galloway won the seat in Bradford. There have been sudden explosions, and I think we have to work on the basis that there is an explosion, and we have to take part in that explosion, working with comrades inside the Labour Party, of whom there are very many very good comrades, very few revolutionary Marxists, but very many people who could be won to socialism. So I think this is a time when Labour Left Alliance and Counterfire could join together. I don't mean physically, I don't mean organisationally. I think all the groups, Communist Party of Great Britain, Socialist Party, Socialist Alternative, etc., 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 Socialist Workers' Party, Counterfire, Socialist Resistance, we can keep our separate organisations, membership lists, propaganda, policies, programmes, but we can look and we can seize the moment and we can all work together.
Right, thank you, Dave. I think that's something that many of us can agree on. I'm going to let the panelists reply to your comments and Tony's comments. So I'm trying to unmute Kate.
Hello. Right.
Oh, I succeeded. Yeah, Kate, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Okay, look, I'll try and be brief. Just to say, okay, first of all, on Tony's points. So I've been a member of the Stop the War Coalition since 2001. I joined it when I was 15, when I was at school and was involved in the school strikes against the Iraq War. It was one of the things that made me a political activist, and have been involved ever since. And it has a long record of fighting racism, and I can just say that it's never excluded anybody on the basis of a pro-Palestinian stance. So I think that's quite an important thing to say. First of all, I would have thought that my comments just a minute ago were quite clear about my stance and my organization's stance on Israel. But yes, of course, Counterfire is an anti-Zionist organization, and a look at the website will show that as well. So just to be clear on that. To come to Dave's point, I mean, I always think that it's very important that the left can get together in whatever form. And you know, I've been involved in all kinds of different projects. Some of them electoral. So I was involved in Respect many years ago, which obviously, you know, as Dave was saying, made some important breakthroughs. I don't know whether this. It doesn't seem to me like this is exactly the moment when the kind of the electoral way of doing things is particularly where people are at. Also, I think when we're talking about uniting the left, I think we've got to realize as well that there's lots of people out there who might not describe themselves as left wing or just becoming political at the moment, particularly with what's happening, but who know that they really want to fight this government, who know that they stand against everything that this government stands for. Who want an alternative, who are interested in socialist ideas and anti-capitalist ideas, all sorts of things. And I think it's very important to get through to them. I think that's the point of the left. And so that to me is always the question about what's the best way forward. It's kind of thinking what are the concrete demands of the moment, what's the most crucial thing, what's the thing that we can unite the biggest number of people together to unite on, what are the goals that we can achieve, what are the victories that we can achieve. And I think that's also very good, because it then means that different organizations have to make up their mind. Are they gonna support the key issue? Are they gonna get involved or not? And that's where kind of, I think, very useful unity is created. For me, it's created in practice, and it's created in action around concrete demands. And I think, you know, when we think about what's happening in the world today, it's very, very clear. And I've tried to outline some of those in my sort of opening gambit, where I think, you know, we are making very, very significant gains. And I think it's enormously important to support things like Stop the War Coalition, to support things like the People's Assembly Against Austerity, so that we can make those gains as a mass movement, but also through doing that, I think, win people to socialist ideas, which I think, you know, have never been so popular.
Thank you. David, do you have anything that you want to respond to Tony and or Dave? Yeah, Dave, sorry.
Well, I would just say briefly that in relation to what Tony said, I mean, I think that there has been a problem on the left. I think even in parts of the revolutionary left about what's happened in relation to Zionism. I think there remains a lack of understanding in parts of the left, I think, on what Zionism is, even although, of course, an organization like Counterfire, coming from the IS tradition, you know, it was born in anti-Zionism. We know that from the work at the very beginning of that process. So, but I think that there is a problem on the left, and indeed in the Muslim community, in understanding what Zionism means today and what it involves, the most recent strategies of the Israeli government and the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. So I would say that there's some learning which could go on across the left on that. On the second question, I think that it relates. I mean, I think that there's a real need in the Labour Party and outside the Labour Party for much more political education for comrades to understand how the world operates today and to commune with each other. You know, COVID has required us to sit looking at computer screens a lot more than would be the case for many of us. I'm afraid that I look at computer screens quite a lot anyhow. But it speaks to the need for us all to be speaking much more to each other and to be thinking much more about how we spread the knowledge of how the world operates in a way that's more effective. Kate was talking about bringing new people into the movement. Of course, that's what we must do all the time. But equally, we must be speaking and learning about the society that we live in and how to change it, perhaps more than we have done heretofore. I say that without any disrespect to the fantastic work that many organisations do. Now, there's a question about whether we need a conference of the entire left. I don't know how you manage that and whether it's a good idea or not, but it does seem to me that there's a need for those on the left to see the importance of anti-imperialism to anti-capitalism and the need to defend people who are being attacked. Now, I've already referred to the people who are attacked in relation to the witch hunt, but of course, you know, there's been a direct attack by our government and the intelligence services on the Muslim community over the last 15 years, and that has led to a huge epidemic of Islamophobia. When I condemned Sarah Champion, you know, the Islamophobia doesn't come from her; it comes from the people in the secret state, especially the counter-terrorism apparatus. These are the ones who have dreamt up the strategies which have targeted Muslims as citizens, but also targeted Muslim civil society groups, such that groups on the left will many groups on the left have a skepticism about involving themselves with people who are visibly Muslim or who are practicing Muslims, and indeed with Muslim civil society groups. The throwing out of of a reasonable society of groups like MEND and CAGE and the Islamic Human Rights Commission is an absolute disgrace, and you know, a real anti-racism which will defend Muslim civil society groups and defend the right of Muslims to engage in politics and two in their faith. It is not. We don't have that yet, and I know that Counterfire and the SWP previous to that have played a strong role in pursuing a kind of politics in that area, but it really is a problem which we have not properly dealt with. I mean, so when we talk about defending solidarity for people who are attacked in relation to the witch hunt, we also let's think of remember people like Malia Bulatia of the National Union of Students, hounded out of office after one term and destroyed on the back of entirely false allegations against her. And now that's part, you know, an attack on the left, but it's also partly part of the attack on Muslims, and we really ought to be doing much more to defend them. So I would say that yes, we should have conferences, and I note that the Campaign for Chris Williamson has organised a conference of the resistance later this year, and we should have events like that, but they must centre anti-imperialism and must centre a sense that it's not just that we are anti-imperialist because of our politics here, but that we're anti-imperialist because we're part of a worldwide movement against imperialism, which doesn't shy away from the difficulties of taking those kinds of positions in the kind of politics that we have here. So I think that's really important. So I would certainly welcome more kind of events, especially if they could be organised across the lines of contemporary political party and group rigidities.
Thank you, David. I mean, the question of political education especially is so important within Labour Party and across the left. And it seems to me, there was a question here in the chat about people who sort of joined to support Corbyn, whether, you know, people, you know, there were quite a lot of people who joined who were perhaps not sort of socialists, and what has been the experience in other areas. See, I'm sort of trying to read the question. I think I get the sense that one of the things that we failed to do with the Corbyn project, those of us in the more sort of radical left, was to radicalize more of the party, if you like, and more of the membership. And that's certainly something that we need to think about going forward. I wanted to take another couple of questions from the written Q&A. So there was the question asked right at the beginning about something we haven't actually addressed yet, really, the leaked report. Sorry, I'm just trying to find it. Yeah, so the question is, how critical will the outcome of the investigation into the leaked report be to the future of socialism in the Labour Party? And we've also got a question about something that's come up a bit in the chat as well, and that I raised a bit earlier, whether the parliamentary route to change is a waste of time, and if we should be looking to other avenues, and whether our main hope might actually be sort of revolutionary aims. So if I could put that to the panelists. I'm sorry that I'm being so slow. I am trying to work out what I'm doing as I'm doing it. Yeah, so Kate, do you is there anything that you want to say about the leaked report and what that might mean for, I mean, not just for the Labour Party, but for the left going forward? I'm not sure what Counterfire's response was to that, if there was one.
Well, I mean, it was one that wasn't, you know, hugely surprised to obviously hear what had been happening in Labour. This is, you know, something that we all knew was happening inside the Labour Party. It was good to see it confirmed in the report, is what I would say. I think, I mean, it seemed to me that the response from the top of the Labour Party was to be completely uninterested in the very widespread allegations of bullying, particularly, it seemed to me, of Black women MPs. And what they seemed more concerned about was who leaked it, and that seemed to go in a witch hunting direction almost instantly. So I don't have particular faith that that's going to make a big that's going to be any kind of gain for us, I suppose. I could say something a little bit about the second question, but not if you don't want me to.
Yeah, no, sure, please do. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, it was just to say that I don't think what happens in Parliament is completely unimportant, and you know, obviously, you know, I'm a big supporter of the Corbyn project, and you know, very much wanted that to succeed as far as it could. I think it depends on what's happening at the time, where we kind of focus our energies, and I think it was right to try and push that project as far as it can go. What I would say though is if everything is reduced to the question of making gains through Parliament, then we're going to lose, because that's not our terrain. That's not where we're strongest, and we have to recognise that we're strongest inside our class, in collective action, in our own organisations. And I think as long as we can understand that, then we can support gains when they're made inside Parliament. We can understand how they can amplify what's happening outside, but we need to see the interrelationship between the two.
Thank you. David, do you have anything to respond to either or both of those questions about the report and about whether we need to go beyond parliamentary politics?
Well, we do need to go beyond parliamentary politics. On the report, I mean, I think that it was a report which was intended by those who commissioned it, including the General Secretary, to show that part of the problem of dealing with anti-Semitism was that they were being delayed by internal opposition by who were in the power structure when Corbyn won, you know, by the centrists, by people who were appointed by Blair and Brown and the like. And it does show that. It does show that they got in the way of dealing with some of the cases. And it does show an extraordinary amount of vituperation and subversion of the organisation which was paying their wages. I mean, truly extraordinary. But it does also, I think, show something which was perhaps not intended by Jenny Formby and those who commissioned the report, which was that the attack on members and the witch hunt against them was indeed encouraged, and the pace of it was increased by Jenny Formby's tenureship. Now, I think that was a bit of a shock to me. I mean, I had written previously that in my own case, I was accused of anti-Semitism by one of these anti-Semitism watchdog groups, Labour Against Anti-Semitism or Harry's Place or one of the others, when they secretly recorded a meeting I'd given, a talk I'd given to Palestinian students. Now, I had been given guidance there to those students about what the IHRA definition meant, and I had said specifically that you should pay attention to that clause in one of the examples, which refers to referring to a state of Israel as a racist endeavour. And I was quoting at the time, actually, John McDonnell's own account of that, which was that if you said that a state of Israel was a racist endeavour, that is, that any imaginable state of Israel would be a racist endeavour, that was anti-Semitic. Whereas if you said the state of Israel, the actual historical state of Israel, was a racist endeavour, that wasn't anti-Semitic. That's actually, as I understand it, the meaning of that sentence. And that was recorded by, I think, someone from Harry's Place. It was then sent to the Labour Party, and they hoped I would be expelled for breaching the IHRA definition, which of course I hadn't done. And I was found, I discovered when they tweeted about it that there'd been an investigation of me without telling me, and it was found there was no case to answer. So I was at that stage quite optimistic that the party was being more sensible about the way in which it was dealing with anti-Semitism queries. But the report, I think, shows the opposite, that there was such pressure to get some of these complaints dealt with, because there'd been a backlog caused by the subversion of the existing staff, that they were actually chucking people out of the party just to get the things finished. And that in the end looked to me like there was an intensification of the process of the witch hunt. And I suppose that's most obviously exemplified at that particular time by the expulsion, well, not the expulsion, but the attempt to expel Chris Williamson. And if we remember, what happened was that he took the party to court, and the court found that the Labour Party was entirely unjustified in expelling him. And they came up with further trumped up charges in the several days before the court case, so they could move towards trying to expel him in any case. So the thing which that tells me is that when the left was in charge of the party, they were complicit in the anti-Semitism witch hunt. That was, I'll not say it was a big shock, but that was a shock to me, that the rot had gone so far to the top. Even someone like Jenny Formby, with a long and proud record of Palestine solidarity activism, was engaged in that kind of process along with others in the leader's office and outside it. So I think that shows something about the ability to take power or through the parliamentary route, or even to try and mildly reform the Parliamentary Labour Party. Absolutely impossible unless you go in with an entirely different agenda or an approach than Dave Corbyn, which would be a much more confrontational one, and which would insist that the rules were followed properly, which would mean very large numbers of MPs being expelled from the party, I'm afraid. So what's the alternative? Well, is, as Kate says, our terrain, the PLP has never been our strength, and the streets has always been the left's strength, and Black Lives Matter shows that so strongly that within a matter of days, the latent anger caused by the system, by capitalism, by imperialism, by racism, can explode into action, and such that a statue in Bristol, where I live, is pulled down after years and years of trying to negotiate through the democratic process, etc. And then, suddenly at the end of that week, the merchant venturers who insisted that the statue couldn't even be labelled in an accurate fashion are saying, oh, well, of course, we don't believe that there should be statues of racists hanging about the centre of the town, and we're entirely supportive of it, etc., etc. So, as was it Dave said, as quoting Lenin, decades happen in a matter of weeks, and let's not forget that. And what we saw indeed in the streets of London, although I think there's been some confusion on the left on this just at the weekend, where although there was a demobilization of Black Lives Matter and some arguments about that, nevertheless, the fascists were beaten back very significantly on the streets in London at the weekend. And I think people don't recognize that. And that process of doing that was a process where not just about Black Lives Matter, but about the anti-racist movement coming together with Black people, people of color, people who are Muslim or from North Africa, coming together and working collectively to beat the fascists back out of the center of London. And that's been a tremendously successful effort, I think, and has not been properly recognized on the radical left, what the significance of that, the emergence of a common action by a whole selection of different groups of people in London. So yes, of course, you know, outside Parliament is where the strength lies, and will continue to lie. And you know, we have to work with the movements to make sure that that has the possibility of prizing open the possibility of change.
Thank you. I think we're going to start to wind up now. I've seen a few people who've had to leave to other meetings. I want to thank both of our speakers so much, and everyone who's participated as well. The chat's been very active, which is really good to see. I mean, it seems clear that from what you've all said that there is a strong desire and need for various sort of groups on the left, on the radical left, to come together, and that we do need to, that the Labour Party might not necessarily be completely beyond hope, but we do need to focus our energies outside of parliamentary politics. And I think especially historians like both Kate and myself probably feel sort of witnessing everything that's happening now, that it really does feel like we're standing on the threshold of change. But the question is what that change will look like. And that depends on us, really. It could really go either way. I mean, as I've said before, the far right, they've been mobilizing now for a long time across borders, and they're well funded. And we're also facing, you know, a brutal economic system that is probably in its death throes, but at the same time is being defended by very, very powerful interests in governments, corporations across the world. So we've got some huge challenges ahead of us, but we've also got some incredible opportunities at the moment. And right now, with so many of us still being in lockdown, it's also a good time to reflect and strategize and organize. We need to, when we come to the sort of the end of this pandemic, the world will be different, and we need to provide the answers. We need to provide direction. And it's really, really uplifting to see. I mean, there's so many Zoom meetings going on at the moment. There's so much being written, and it's so positive to see, and also to see all the young people out on the streets toppling statues and demanding the change that we should have had a long time ago. I feel, as I always do after these kinds of meetings, quite sort of inspired and hopeful. And yeah, I want to thank Kate and David again, and thank all of you for your contributions. We've had some debates in our local group about whether we should have these meetings as a webinar, or as a Zoom where everyone can see each other. And I was for the webinar option, but now I actually feel a bit like I wish that I could see you all. It does feel a bit odd to sort of just sit here talking to myself. But yeah, thank you. It's been a great meeting. I think some really good contributions, and hopefully see you all again soon. If not on Zoom, then hopefully out there at a real meeting or at a protest sometime soon. All right, I'm going to end the meeting now. So thanks very much, and have a lovely evening, everyone. Take care. Bye.